Hello and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this episode of our Toward Life 3.0 series. My name is Mathias Risse, and I am the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I am welcoming you also on behalf of Sushma Raman, who is our executive director and who will join us at the Q&A stage a little later. Now, the series Towards Life 3.0, Ethics and Technology in the 21st Century, as many of you know, has now been going on for a few years. The title we take from Max Tegmark's book, Life 3.0, being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. The goal of this series is to explore ethical and human rights related challenges that arise in the course of the technological innovation that is happening all around us, and that might eventually take us to a full-fledged Life 3.0, a phase of life populated by entities that get to design both their culture, their software, so to speak, and their bodies, their hardware. Now, we do not know if that kind of life will ever emerge or when, but we also don't want to start thinking about its ethical dimensions only once it's clear that it will indeed emerge. And in any event, there are plenty of such challenges all around us already that occur as part of technological innovation and that require attention entirely on their own merits, quite regardless of the project of Max Tegmark's book. Now, some of those challenges, some of the challenges that already very much demand our attention in the domain of technical innovation are coming from the domain of criminal justice in the United States, which is a domain that is very much deserving of the highest level of everybody's attention. There are two key facts about the American criminal justice system that we should always firmly keep in mind, and that make the American way of administering criminal justice so strikingly different from that of most countries with similar economic and political systems. The first of these is that 1 in 4 people housed in a prison anywhere in the world is housed in an American prison. 1 in 4, that means 25%, even though the US population is only 5% of the global population. And then secondly, second fact, 70 million, a staggering 70 million Americans, 70, have a criminal record. That is 1 in 3 adults. It is obvious from these numbers alone that much of the American criminal justice system requires very serious rethinking. And it is impossible to detach the current realities of the system from its historical realities, from the fact that it is ultimately enslavement that lies at the roots of mass incarceration, from the fact that the staggering economic inequalities in this country protect some people much more from its own criminal justice system than it protects others, and from the fact that criminal justice is often intensely politicized at all levels of governance. And as we are now rethinking many domains of life in light of the possibilities that come from technological innovation, we have to make sure that the failures of the past do not translate into a more high-tech version of ever the same in the future. For this reason, today's topic is both enormously relevant and unfortunately always timely, and that topic is mass incarceration and the human rights implications of artificial intelligence. And on that topic, we are very fortunate to have with us today Laurin Leonard, who is a former Carr Center fellow, and Laurin is also the executive director of Mission Launch, so Mission::Launch, and a co-founder of R3 Score. Now, the background of this work is the lived experience with mass incarceration and its consequences that Laurin and her mother, Teresa Hodge, have had. Teresa Hodge spent about 6 years in prison, and at the end of that time, found herself experiencing enormous difficulties re-entering the workforce. The combination of having a criminal record and having a low credit score, phenomena that for various reasons tend to go together, created rather forbidding obstacles to rebuilding a normal life, an experience that tens of millions of people in the US have made. It was in response to these experiences that Laurin and Teresa started Mission Launch, their business and leadership development accelerator for entrepreneurs living with criminal convictions, which is an accelerator called Launchpad, has supported the formation of worker-owned cooperatives, sole proprietorships, and limited liability corporations throughout Maryland and Washington, so the DC region. And this work has led them to be named Foot Soldiers of the Week on MSNBC's Melissa Harris Perry show. And then our three score came out of Launchpad as Laurin and Teresa discovered the need for helping entrepreneurs navigate around a standard background check, especially when seeking financial products and services. Laurin is a graduate of Old Dominion University and the Johns Hopkins University Carey Business School and a proud member of various fellowships and communities, among other things, of course, the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. So Laurin, we are delighted to have you back. I turn over to Laurin now, who will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll have a Q&A. The Q&A, and so Sushma Raman, the Executive Director of the Carr Center, will join us for that. But you, the audience, are also very much encouraged to put your questions in the YouTube chat. So we're very eager to hear from you, and we will integrate your questions into our conversation with Laurin afterwards. But now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming back Laurin Leonard to the Carr Center.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's exciting always to be back. And in the world of post-COVID and all of these seminars, I can't see anybody, but I'm excited that everyone, for those of you who are here, that you're joining us. So as mentioned, my name is Laurin Leonard, and I am a co-founder of two organizations that serve in the criminal justice sector. We had a little bit of a reverse. In 2012, my mother and I started our first entity, Mission Launch. At the time, I was the executive director. At the end of last year, I became the CEO of R3 Score, and my mom is the executive director of Mission Launch now. So I think one of the things that I will probably start with is the two big anchoring statistics have already been shared. But what I will do just is to kind of reinforce the current status quo and the reason why we were excited about becoming Carr Center Fellows, and to really discuss some of the conversations that don't always see, in one sense, the light of day, which is the fact that there is 1 in 3 people who has an arrest or conviction record in this country. And our discussion paper focused on the reality of, by the year 2030, that number is expected to be 100 million people, or 1 in 2 adults, which means without major disruptions in the way that we rely on our criminal justice system in America, half of our population, half of the US population, will have come in contact with the criminal justice system for a whole host of reasons. The ability to have a conversation around machine learning and artificial intelligence in a lot of ways is a conversation that most people aren't really focused on, because we're still having very basic conversations around racism and policing, around the role of prosecutors and judges, around the conditions and opportunities or lack thereof in our prisons and jails. We are still trying to figure out, how do we address substance abuse and mental health instead of relying on our criminal justice system. The school to prison pipeline, there's great conversation as to whether or not you should have police officers in school. And one of the things that I think some people are interested in is, what is the real connectivity around here? And the unfortunate part is our criminal justice system is both complicated and complex. And what that means is it's interconnected in so many ways. It's an extremely sticky institution. And what the opportunity to understand the stickiness of it is that 7 out of 10 kids who have an incarcerated parent, so not even that they themselves have become incarcerated, but just having a parent makes you more likely to serve time in prison or jail. That the overwhelming impact of coming in contact with the criminal justice system sees that families see wealth depletion to 40 to 60%. So in the end, this is an institution that so many of us have been trained to not come in contact with, that is an institution for other people, that you want to do everything you can to avoid that. And so as a society, we have turned a blind eye. We just assumed that, I believe, our government was going to do what needed to be done, and that, that was something that you just never really wanted to consider. Unfortunately, we're all waking up to the beast in one sense, which is the fact that mass incarceration as a phenomenon has touched just about every major part of institutions in our country. And there is an opportunity really here to have accelerated dialogue, to get to a place where we're no longer talking about the very basics, such as people's human rights as it relates to policing, but that we can talk about a future and begin to imagine what a world looks like where potentially there are no humans making decisions, because we know that the outcomes, even when humans make decisions related to criminal justice and related to people who have records, are really bad. So there are over 50,000 known collateral consequences, which are barriers, restrictions, or sanctions that one faces just by having a criminal record. That means a person who has a record could hit any number of walls in their life, and 50,000 ways we know, 60% of them are related to workforce. So that means that when you are looking to rejoin society, when you're looking to find employment, a livable wage, there are tens of thousands of ways in which you will face barriers. The benefit to really having at least that quantification of it is that we can start to then dig into the fact that by coming in contact with the criminal justice system, for the rest of your life, you will earn about 40% less than you could have because of workforce discrimination, because of prejudice and bias in hiring. You're likely to see a 40 to 60% drop in your credit score, which we know of in a very particular time. And unfortunately, the economic building blocks of the US society require that we plug people in to employment at various levels, because if you're never really given the right to earn, housing, entering into financial mainstream situations, education, access to insurance, food insecurity, all of these things should start to compound on each other. What sits central really to the ability to move forward or not is the criminal background check. So through our fellowship, we were able to actually look at this data, start to unpack some things. And one of the central questions that came up for us, which is, where is the line between the rights of society and the rights of people? We opened our paper. If anyone has read it before, you will notice that we used a Twitter picture to start with the very beginning of kind of framing. Fundamentally, we believe that moving the conversation around criminal justice forward begins with the language conversation. My first degree is in sociology, so unfortunately, I always kind of go back to some of that initial training. But the way that we talk about each other really actually does matter. This isn't just me saying it. There's lots of research around that shows. When we call people anything related to ex-con, ex-felon, ex-anything, it is a title and the label that keeps them perpetually locked into a place that is historical in nature. It's as if I would call myself an ex-high school student. It would not tell you that I actually went to undergraduate, I went to graduate. You might not even know that I'm actually 36 years old and not a 16-year-old. But when we call people things like ex fill in the blank, which is often used in criminal justice, it means that we are perpetually forcing ourselves and that person to see themselves in a historical place, not giving any room for them to move forward, which is to all of our benefit and advantage. For a while, there was language such as returning citizen, and that language has begun to shift, because just even unpacking that as a title, returning, the ing, applies or implies that you're perpetually in the state of never really connected. And then the question is, what is the definition of returning, and then who's returned? It gets really sloppy. So one of the things that I always encourage people to do is, one, be okay with potentially saying the wrong things, but also challenge yourself to use humanizing language, because being able to make sure that we're meeting a future of artificial intelligence means the humans have to get better at how we talk about each other and how we think about each other. So the language that right now, and again, language shifts in society, that we are encouraging and you will start to see more people use is people living with records, right? It's no different, or people with criminal histories. Way more words technically, but the ability to use more words and still connect people to their humanity is fundamentally important when we get to the role of machines and artificial intelligence. The rise of criminal background checks in this US is because of a series of things. For a lot of people, after September 11th, we saw that 5 out of 10 employers who were running background checks skyrocketed to 9 out of 10. When we look at the ability to digitize government records, because a lot of the criminal justice databases are government affiliated, this was colliding with the fact that background checks as an industry are relatively low barrier business to start, because these databases technically can be accessed and open if you establish a reporting agency to do so. So it was a bit of a snowball effect that got us to this place where a third of the country has a record and 9 out of 10 employers run a criminal background check, 4 out of 5 landlords run a background check, and 3 out of 5 colleges and universities run a background check. So we have on one side a lot of people who have criminal records. On the other side, we have decision makers that are now using what was technically a criminal investigation tool as a decision-making tool to help them, in one sense, understand who people are, except for, as we get into the technology that we've created, it's really having a moment to argue with ourselves that, are you getting a snapshot of who a person is, or are you checking a criminal justice database system to see if any data existed with no real context of that time in their lives? I will do a really quick fast forward, but the reason why we were very excited to have the fellowship in the Carr Center is because the human rights conversation is one that we begin to anchor into, which is, what are the rights of people who, unfortunately, for a significant portion of the population, may feel like you've given up your rights because there was a breach, either a breach in trust, there was a breach in safety and security for society or for individuals. And the conversation, which is, how do we repair the breach? How do we build trust? And how do we reintegrate people back into society and restore them to their full citizenship and their full rights? I think in the future of machine learning and artificial intelligence, we now have to have a conversation about data rights. For those of us who are on social media, there are data rights policies around what you have rights to and what the business has rights to. When it comes to your criminal justice data, which is technically governed by the same federal statutes that govern your credit check, there isn't really a clear idea as to, is it the government's data about me, or is this my data? Am I in control of who sees the data, who has access to the data at all times? While there is some guidelines and some statutes that we follow for hiring, it's under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. You cannot have an employer run a background check on you without your consent, so you do have to opt in. However, the decision to know which data they see, you don't get to pick. The decision to know which vendor they use, you don't get to pick. And if they don't use a vendor that allows you to contextualize the data, a decision maker gets to see historical snapshot data about an individual, make a decision, and then inform them of that decision, oftentimes with no real conversation or dialogue. The reason why that's important is when we look at the criminalization of poverty, when we look at racial outcomes with our criminal justice system, we know that marginalized communities are more likely to come in contact with the criminal justice system. Therefore, it's not really shocking that communities that are already marginalized also have records. And so again, we get to this compounding effect. I think the thing that I will begin to transition this portion of the conversation and open it up to Q&A on is, over 50% of the FBI's database is inaccurate or incomplete. That is a statistic that was provided by the FBI. And I think one of the things that we really want to have a conversation about is, how do we come to a place of data rights and data integrity? Because if an individual's life circumstances are greatly impacted by the data that's in and aggregated through a criminal background check, and there are ways in which we know that data is not always complete, that it may not be the most accurate information, and yet it's still used, the question of who's responsible for this data matters. In a future world in which, like, for example, the science fiction part of it, where potentially there's more robots than humans, or machines are making decisions more than humans, what we have to get to is that our data right now around criminal justice related data, the other day someone said it, and I enjoy the way it framed it, which is, it's just poison. The unfortunate nature of the criminal justice related data is that oftentimes it includes police reports. And as we're having a dialogue around policing in this country, we have to also acknowledge that a police officer has the ability to put data in. And the question is this data ever validated? Is it ever checked? If there are inaccuracies, do you have to return back to the policing station, or where do you go to get this data corrected? There's also the opportunity for judges to add notes. And when a person goes into our criminal justice system in prison or jails, there's data that gets collected on them as well. And so we have trails of data all over. These systems may or may not talk. And throughout that chain, there's conversations around race, there's conversations around income, there's conversations around being a person who's able-bodied or not. There's conversations around sexual orientation and bias in that regard. And in the end, there's no real clear path to how we hold ourselves accountable. Because 100%, I think we all would agree that we want to be a part of safe communities and we want to be a part of a safe society. And yet we need to make sure that we have a pathway to restore rights to people. And that includes their data, and that includes their criminal justice data. Because in a future in which few people are making decisions, that's the data that will allow machines to perpetually lock out potentially half of the US population or not. I think our paper, again, ended on a pathway of wanting to have cross-collaboration conversations, because this isn't a problem that one really smart person can solve. This is going to take policy advocates coming together. This is going to take government officials coming together. This is going to take community members and those who are directly impacted telling their stories about the barriers that they hit. So for example, we know that there is bias that's hard-coded into systems where if you're applying for opportunities online and you check a box that says, yes, I have ever, there's always boxes, have you ever been convicted of a crime or or ever been convicted of a misdemeanor or felony? That from the moment you check the box, the screen goes blank. And then what comes up is a notification that says something you just said disqualified you, with no interaction or no engagement with the decision maker. You can't even persist to even be considered on your merits. And so we know that that's already hard-coded into very basic algorithms. A future in which we are still trying to know if it will ever really happen requires that we have sobering, hard, honest conversations to make sure that we are building these systems right. And then after we've built it, that is this still really the right system? So I will pause there because I feel like that was a lot. And then if you guys have any questions, we can go from there.
Thank you so much, Laurin, for joining us today and for your remarks and for your life's work in this area. So I have so many questions, but I'll just start with, I'm wondering with respect to this work on criminal background checks, it seems like there's various entry points for work on criminal justice reform, right? And so I'm curious as to how you arrived at criminal background checks versus some of the other entry points that other organizations use, as well as advocates, for example, thinking about the ways in which people are arrested or sentenced, issues of parole, issues of sentencing, et cetera. So how did you arrive at this particular niche area? And then how do you work with groups that are working in other aspects of reform or abolition?
Yeah. So coming to this part of it was as my mother went through the entire life cycle. So she fought for 3 years through the Maryland state court system to defend herself. And she won her Maryland case. What she didn't know was repackaged and retried as a federal case. And it was in that federal case that she then went to the court system to defend herself. And she discovered that the federal government has a 96%, I believe, success ratio on indictment. So technically, if you're ever indicted, it's extremely likely that you will be found guilty. And that once you go to the court system to defend yourself, that oftentimes the judge may be given the opportunity to give enhancements. So just by going to defend yourself, you're given a harsher sentence. We learned all of that. My mom served time in Alderson Federal Prison Camp. And so we met a lot of the women, we had conversations with them. She went through the halfway house and went through probation. And as we were going through this journey ourselves, we saw a lot of really good organizations doing good work. The one area we felt like was still ripe for innovation was in this reentry space. A lot of the reentry work, while great work, is really focused on how do we get people, in one sense, in the very beginning, connected to opportunity. I think one of the statistics is that within the first 90 days, if a person is not connected to community, to family, to employment, they're more likely to return back to prison or jail. And so a lot of interventions are, can we get you an entry-level job? Can I get you 1 or 2 suits to get to the interview? Can I get you a bus pass to the interview? And in one sense, it's kind of like, we got you kind of in the door. And then this bigger conversation, which is how do we keep people sustainably in community? And how do we allow those who have served their time and still feel like they have a tremendous amount of capacity to live out their highest and best potential, which, for us is a part of a human rights value. I think that's where we got to that space. And then the more we dug in, we recognized it really is the criminal background check that keeps people in this constant state. Because if you've been home for 2 years, which has happened even in the DC area, the Washington Metro, the train system a couple years back, they changed their background check vendor. They had people who had been working for over a decade there. The moment that the new background check vendor was acquired and people had to get new background checks, they got fired, even though they had 10 plus years of successfully working on the job. This is the one place that if we can really intervene on the data and really intervene on the packaging of the data and having conversations around the information we use on each other, we believe we can actually start to see the needle move.
Thank you, Laurin. So first of all, I want to say this linguistic proposal that you had of talking about people living with criminal records, I think that is really it's a great, it's very sensible, and I think this is also, there's lots of phenomena like that where we are speaking a language that is reflecting, the injustices in society, and by talking a certain way, for example, talking about ex-convicts, right? We're just perpetuating a lot of that, right? And we're just kind of projecting things into the future that may not belong into the future. And so a somewhat different form of expressing ourselves, like people living with criminal records in this case. I think this is a very, very forward-looking move here. I meant to ask you something slightly different, though, kind of connecting to Sushma's question. So can you tell us a little bit more about what R3 score, what kind of information that is, and how it is, how you come by that information, how it's going to be fielded, and then also maybe what is the role of technology going into the gathering of that kind of information?
Yeah, absolutely. So R3 score starts with a fair credit reporting at criminal background check. So we, like a standard background check, go to the data service providers. And first I should go back to, so we are in existence. We have customers that buy our product. Businesses pay us to run a background check on individuals that they're assessing, either for a business opportunity, meaning to hire them, or for a small business loan. So we have community lenders that are looking to make small business loans to entrepreneurs with records. And their position is, we would like to use R3 score as a form of like an alternative credit score. So they still run a standard credit score, but they don't run a standard background check. So a business comes to R3 score, they request that we have a candidate assessed. Because it's FCRA, the candidate has to give us consent. So we first get the individual's opt-in. Once that's completed, we go through our process to get their information, their identifying information. We, like a standard background check, query the databases that our customers have requested that we query because they're trying to manage their business risk. But the thing that makes us fundamentally different is we do a 15 to 20 minute intake interview with the individual. Our interviewers do not see the background check, which means they have no idea who has a record or not. R3 score actually does score people who don't have records. But what it is, the intervention is the opportunity to have people who have records give context. And so what we find is people who have criminal records, oftentimes because they face perpetual prejudice, they over-disclose a lot of information. So they may come to the interview and tell the interviewer a significant number of things. And so the information is designed to give more user consented data. Last July, Equifax put out a report that in the fintech space, what they're seeing is that the reason why businesses are requesting more user consented data is because kind of a very fundamental logic, which is better data in, better data out. So for anyone who has seen the commercials for Experian Boost, I will give you the spoiler as to what the boost is. The boost is simply you opting in to add things like your utility bill, your cell phone bill, any additional data pieces that are out there about how you show up as a consumer, how you spend, gets now integrated into your credit score. And so the interview is designed to be the same way. We're able to take information that is both verifiable as well as industry standard as non-verifiable. So I'll give you an example of things that are potentially non-verifiable. In the community lending space, when we've interviewed our customers there, what we found is when an individual goes in to make a request for a loan, the loan officer may ask you a series of questions like, oh, well, tell me about who you are. Do you volunteer anywhere? Do you go to church? These are things that they never actually verify, but what we've come to discover is in the human decision-making process, it de-risks the person, because what it indicates is that you are showing up in community, that someone somewhere knows you and potentially could validate you, even though in most instances, the loan officer never goes to verify, are you actually a parishioner at that church? And so we're able to collect this information. It then gets put into our system. We have about 20 algorithms that work together to produce 2 unique scores. Our first score is a criminal history index. It's a 0 to 10, 0 indicating that there's no FCRA compliant data to disclose, and therefore the person is no to low risk. 10 indicates that the person's data would show the highest risk according to a whole host of research. And then what we do is we tell a business, yes, this person has a criminal record, but of the tens of thousands of legal statutes that are in this country, here's where this thing falls. And the reason why that's important is because most people, when they hear people with criminal records, they're either thinking jaywalking, and now what a lot of people are thinking of marijuana, which, as you know, in this country, it's going through this conversation of legalization, or people are thinking murder. We really don't know how to process all of the things in between. And so the prejudice that most of us have against people with records, it's either I think it's nothing or absolutely think it's the worst thing. And therefore, to manage my risk, I'm just going to say no. And so it allows us to indicate that everything is not black and white, that there are shades of gray, that businesses really just need to establish what is their risk tolerance, and they can move forward with folks with records once they do their diligence in-house to say, you don't have to say no, you just have to figure out what are you willing to say yes to. The second score that we produce is 300 to 850. It's like a credit score. It is not a credit score, it does not predict default. But the job to be done for the advanced score is actually to help a decision maker, again, understand how stable the person is. This is where human bias also comes in. When we find out people have records, we assume, and this is why when I use the term returning citizen, we assume you're not stable. You may find out a person has a record and their record was 6 years ago. But if you talk to them, they've made a significant number of impacts and changes in their life, except for FCRA statute says that it can't fall off their record until 7 years. However, you might be indicating that you assume it's someone who just was recently released. You might not know if they have housing. And again, stability becomes a proxy for reliability, which for an employer, for a bank, they're using that. And so our stability indicator allows an individual to be assessed against a more accurate peer group. Most of our risk models, especially around credit scoring, are designed for a traditional consumer type. And traditional used to mean white, male, college educated, married, and lives within a certain zip code. Even beyond folks with records, the average consumer in this country no longer really fits that profile. And so being able to now ask questions and begin to understand what's a more reflective peer group and see how people are trending towards stability in a more accurate peer group helps a decision maker to have all that information. And I feel like that was a lot of information. So you probably may have another question about that. But.
So we have a question from our audience, which I'd like to draw on for. So there have been changes in state laws in recent years, which have eliminated collateral consequences of conviction. How do you think they've changed the employment and housing prospects of individuals who have been affected by criminal records?
So I think that's where it's a little complicated because there's no universal answer. And that's just partly because reentry is hyper local, meaning there's like federal statutes, there's state statutes, depending upon the state. Sometimes the county or the city statutes make all the difference. But what I will say is there are some examples in which there is some change happening. We also, unfortunately, now have enough data on movements such as Ban the Box, which were intended to remove the box that I talked about. So on an application, you no longer have to check the box to disclose that you have a record. However, we have found that people are finding ways to still discriminate. They're just not discriminating in the beginning of the process. They're discriminating towards the decision-making point. And I think there's a combination of the things we have to do, which is process and also softening the ground with heads and hearts. I think the Ban the Box movement showed us that we can change the process of how we collect this data, but if we don't change the stigmatization, and really this conversation around humanization, then we give people still an opportunity to discriminate towards the end. I know in Seattle, Washington, they changed a law which said that a landlord could no longer ask, I think either for a background check or some statute around there. And there was this dialogue potentially around like, this is great, more people are gonna get housing. What we saw was the fear increased, because if the landlord felt like they couldn't ask the question, then it was a matter of, well, now I don't know who to trust or how I should navigate this. So again, in that case, it's needing to navigate both sides of this dialogue, which is changing the law for changing the law's sake without really adding support to community engagement, community awareness, giving decision makers the tools they need, doesn't always lead to the immediate outcomes. It is 100%, criminal justice is going to require coming at this from all angles, and it's not just going to be solved by policy.
Laurin, I have one more question, actually, of clarification on something that you said as you gave your introductory remarks. You said something about how a lion's share of the data that the FBI has is faulty one way or another, and that's why the formulation of excuse me, poisonous thank you, poisonous data.
It's a good time to sneeze.
It's a good time to sneeze. Yeah, it's like, some of my brain must have processed that the right way then, right? So can you just elaborate on this a little bit more? So how come that our the Federal Bureau of Investigation is sitting on such a heap of poisonous data? How do they come by these data, and why is this so much at odds with how it should be, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, I think so I don't have probably the clean answer for this. That was a report that came out years ago, and I think some of this has to deal with we have not held ourselves accountable to a conversation around data, to be honest. Like, the data that we think is valuable for whatever reason is like your Facebook data. We have a lot of conversations around who owns your Facebook data. And if you were to download your data rights on Facebook, it's like a manual this thick. Unfortunately, I think some of the criminal justice related data gets to be a part of that out of sight, out of mind. We don't force ourselves into this dialogue. A lot of the data that's in the databases, again, are input from various parties of our criminal justice system. So when a police officer is dispatched, that's kind of in one sense the beginning of a data trail, right? There's data that is there. If it requires going into the court system kind of has an additional piece of data that gets put in. If a person is incarcerated, the facility gets to contribute the data. Some of the data then gets transitioned to a halfway house. So I think the unfortunate part is, and this is where we get to the inaccurate and incomplete, is a police officer might have started the data trail. A judge changes one piece of that, but if the judge doesn't have a pathway to force the police officer to go back and correct the data, it just kind of stays in this limbo, so to speak, where we continue to add more information that is not fully packaged properly. And there's really no checks and balances around who gets to review this long potential file with an individual and say that. And I think this is where one of the things we're excited about really forcing a conversation, which is the person who has the highest pain point in all this is the person whose data it is. Like, they're the most likely to care that there's something inaccurate. So think about our credit scores in this country. If you saw that someone charged you for $20,000, you're like, this isn't even mine. The first thing you do is figure out what are your rights to get it off. And you'd see, in one sense, very clean steps you can take to dispute the charges, to have the charges eventually removed. You would then be given documentation on how to speak about it to a potential future creditor. You would say, hey, my identity was stolen. Like, we've documented that process. The opportunity to have a criminal justice and data and machine learning and artificial intelligence conversation is the opportunity to finally have that conversation for people in their criminal histories, to tell people, hey, go pull your criminal background check and make sure there's nothing on it that's not inaccurate and incomplete. And then we get into this weird spot of, but then what if there is something there and where do I go? And I think that's where the checks and balances really comes into play, because someone really should be accountable for this information that has the ability to hold you back for the rest of your life, not being complete because maybe even there was a human error and someone forgot to do this. I know when I ran my background check, it looked as if someone had stolen my identity because somehow my social security number got attached to some transactions in Washington state, which for me, I was like, what? And then I, one time as a recent graduate, went to rent a basement apartment of someone in Silver Spring. And she was like, do you know you have a traffic misdemeanor from college? I was like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. I thought, completely honest, that because I paid the ticket in the state of Virginia, it was over. I didn't recognize that I actually needed to appear for court and pay the ticket. And even me, I do this work. I'm like, I have no idea how to get that off. And I just assume at this point, because it was college, that it's off. But this is the conversations that we need to have. And because it's an out of sight, out of mind institution, we almost never have it, right? Like, so the idea that I'm like, yep, I apparently have a traffic misdemeanor. I have no idea what to do about it. And I just hope eventually it falls off. But in that case, because I was renting a basement apartment, you know, the landlord liked me. She's like, hey, let's just make sure that, is this like, what is this? And she's like, oh yeah, I got a traffic ticket too, that's fine. But that's because when we get to the data service and use, she paid $20 for a background check on me, which didn't really hit the threshold of an HR level background check, which an HR level background check would have weeded all that out, which is how I never knew that it was on there. I never actually saw the background check she had, but in this country, if you have $20 in a person's social security number, you can run a background check on them, except for you're going to get traffic violations, random pieces of criminal justice data that even an employer might not ever see.
So, Laurin, I'm wondering about how do you reconcile with the fact that more data or better quality data or even options to round out data with, you know, other data points to provide a more nuanced look at a human being don't take into account necessarily sort of the systemic bias, the discrimination against specific groups, whether it's by race or by income, or sometimes an intersection of both, that exist in the criminal justice system, as well as in, you know, many other adjacent systems in the US. So how do you handle that in your work, or that you see handled by others who are doing work in this space?
Well, I think so we have intentionally done some work to address where our bias is, because, you know, it's impossible for a human being not to have it. Even human beings that try their best not to have it, we all do. And I think that as part of our algorithm design process, we had several designers come in, sit with us, and start to think through where our bias is. We would challenge where their bias is. I think the opportunity for us is to just be radically honest about the outcomes. And this is where a lot of criminal justice related risk models should be challenged, which is especially the ones that are in the court systems. So you'll see technology in court systems that's designed to help judges understand what they should sentence. Like, those kind of give me a lot of pause, because who does the math on that? And if the outcomes are that certain judges have higher sentences, or if the outcome is that certain people from certain zip codes seem to always get, you know, more punitive charges, then I think we have to say, like, how is this always happening? I think that is one benefit, if we're honest about technology, is the math will point us into what we believe the outcomes should be. And if the outcomes start to demonstrate kind of fairness across the board, then we know we're probably doing a good job. If the outcomes are that the same profile of person always shows up with the same outcome, it's really not that difficult to extrapolate that, like, the math is doing something some way. I think for some people who don't like all of the qualitative stuff, they like that, like, algorithms at their core are just really sophisticated math equations. I think in the end, this is the piece where it actually gives us this urgency, because if we can't even be honest about data integrity and data rights, we're going to lose so much time, because risk models and algorithms are now in sentencing, they're in kind of the establishment of financial fines, they're a part of probation. There's risk models that determine who gets released from prison, or like, it's showing up more and more in the criminal justice sector. And if we're not starting with, do we even have good data to work off of, then 100% all of the prejudice that we see is just going to be compounded. I think that was one of the things that was big as part of our paper is this thing is just like a compounding or a snowball effect. And if we do not get in front of it, it's not that, I'm optimistic at heart. I kind of feel like I'm a doomsday person when I talk about this stuff, because I don't mean to be, but it really is just like, we've got to move faster. We've got to move with some level of commitment to ensuring that in 9 years, if more risk models are used in criminal justice, half of this country is not perpetually locked into an underclass in which there really is no way to get them out of that, other than really, really radical interventions, which for most major systems, I'm not even sure what that would look like.
So maybe as a follow-up to a couple of things that you said now, maybe for the benefit of our audience also, could you tell us a bit more about how algorithms, any kind of machine learning is used these days when it comes to either sentencing or also parole decisions? Can you just provide a little bit more background information on these topics?
Sure. So the intention, so there's, I can't get to the intention of all of the founding teams, right? Because everybody starts a business for a very different reason. I think one of the things that is important, which was one of the things we discussed in the paper, is the nature of capitalism cannot be kind of just completely dismissed in that, which is this is a space that's ripe for change, period, point blank. Business owners will see the opportunity. This is an opportunity for even governments to participate, because a lot of the data, as I mentioned, is digitized and sits with governments. So we have this cross section of business opportunity, government interest, that's kind of coming together. Then what we're seeing is the question of, some people are starting off, I believe, maybe with good intentions, which is how do we find equity and fairness in this, so that potentially you remove the bias of a judge, or you remove the bias of someone who's determining probation, and you say, hey, just put this person's whole data, their whole data file in the system, and just trust the system to kick out the right decision. The unfortunate part kind of with that even hands-off approach is it brings us back into that space. So there are judges who have been trying to find ways to be more fair. And so their position was, maybe a machine could do better than me, because I don't know all the zip codes in my jurisdiction. There's no way of me knowing that the person in front of me is coming from a census tract that is perpetually underinvested and underserved, and therefore more likely to have ended up in front of me to begin with. So there are some people on kind of the good side of it, I think, who are trying to find a way to see if they can have equity in their decision-making, because just all of the various components to what makes a person and all the context to how they ended up in the criminal justice system, it's actually it's a lot of pieces. I think on the bad side, there are those that see the business opportunity. And the unfortunate part is if you're there to see the business opportunity, you're not really held accountable to the outcome of the thing that you produced, right? But again, because there's an interest in government, you can go get a contract. And so when probation decisions are made, it's again, okay, we have this new vendor. They told us all we have to do is put a person's identifying information in. All of this data is going to be transferred over, and then there's going to be a number that pops up on the screen, and that should be the decision. And there's just kind of the removal of humans and human engagement in that process.
So Laurin, I'm wondering if people want to learn more about work in this space, both about your organizations as well as other organizations, what are some resources that you can recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to learn more about our nonprofit work, that website is mission-launch.org. If you want to learn more about the tech startup, that's r3score.com. An organization that I'm affiliated with and I believe does really great work is called Just Leadership USA. It's an organization that is a national entity that does various forms of training and advocacy for directly impacted people and people who have records themselves. One of the things that I think has been instrumental in the shift in the criminal justice sector is acknowledging that the lived experience makes you a subject matter expert. It used to be that interventions and programs and things were designed for people. Just Leadership is an organization that helps you understand really that the person who has the lived experience should be the person doing a lot of the designing. I think if you are a person who reads or likes movies, Brian Stevenson's work, Just Mercy, is something that a lot of people refer to. And then there's actually a significant number of books that have recently come out, and unfortunately they're escaping me and I didn't come ready with that. So I apologize that I don't have a longer list.
So a question, kind of a future-directed question, Laurin. So you said kind of in passing earlier that the larger concern here is, what kind of information should be available about us, and how should what kind of information should guide decision making that concerns us, and one thing that's quite striking here is also in terms of this serious kind of forward looking to next Monday is that in the business, in the private sector, there's an enormous level of sophistication there, right? So Shoshana Zuboff, who will be in this series next week, has written this fascinating book on surveillance capitalism. So there the theme is, the collecting of data has become so important for the current version of capitalism that it actually makes sense to just call the whole thing surveillance capitalism, right? So basically everything, right? So everything we do, any kind of use of electronic devices generates data, right? And it's there for the picking for anybody who owns the platforms, and they're doing that in amazingly sophisticated ways, which is, the tip of the iceberg of that is that the catered advertising, right? That what each person sees is. So the private sector is doing amazingly, so amazingly sophisticated at that, and they're really good at that to just pitch things to you in very fine-grained ways, right? And as opposed to that, in the the way we are using in the in the employment domain, often the way information is processed is exactly the opposite, right? So that often in the TED talk that your mom gave, she just talks about this in this very moving way that she's worked these on a screen applying for a job, and at some point there's this question: do you have a criminal record, right? And then the screen goes blank if you type yes, right? So in many cases, the level of information gathering in these employment domains is medieval compared to the 21st century level of sophistication that we have in the private sector. And of course, one way of thinking about what you guys are doing, especially with the R3 score, is you want to bring some version of that sophistication that that happens in the private sector everywhere to the employment market. So if you look ahead, Laurin, this kind of the 10-year vision, how do you see your own work, this line of work developing? What are your hopes for where we are when it's turning 2030?
Absolutely. I think one of our hopes is that our product becomes the gold standard of background checks. Because in the end, we would have done our job if the market no longer wants historical data, right? To exactly your point, which is everywhere else, people want the freshest data. They want to know, what was the thing you just clicked 2 minutes ago? When it comes to criminal justice data, we're willing to take data that's 7 years old on face value, right? Not even accounting for that this person has done a significant number of things every single day that they woke up in those 7 years. And I use 7 just because most criminal background checks that are FCRA compliant, after the 7-year mark, some things just kind of fall off, even though they technically still exist, right? So depending upon the type of background check vendor that you have, you may or may not see it. I think by 2030, we would have done our job if it's no longer acceptable to give people stale data. I think by 2030, we would have done our job if governments are willing to have a conversation with the people whose data that they collect and establish a line in which that data becomes the right of the individual. I think for a whole host of reasons, I understand why our data system and our data trail around criminal justice starts with government affiliated entities and sits in government affiliated databases. I think at some point, though, the data has to get out of that government wall, just because, you know, when you look at data and movement, to your point about the private sector, the government usually doesn't lead the private sector. The private sector usually pushes the government in a different direction. I think we would have done our job if government say, you know, we may start the data trail, but this is actually your data. And especially for local governments, we are a partner in your reentry. So even if you are sentenced to prison or jail, a significant number of people actually go back to where they were arrested, or they go back to where they were originally, which means it's to your advantage that when people come back home and come into community, they feel ownership over their data. They want to make sure that it's accurate, that it's right, and they want to contribute positive things that they're doing to their data. And then I think beyond that, we get to this future conversation in which we have clarity. I think a big chunk of this work is just really unclear. Like, it's opaque about what your rights are. It's actually not clear if you have any rights for most people. And then you don't even know how to enforce them. I think we use Credit Karma as an example, but it's like Credit Karma did for credit scores what our 3Score hopes to do for background checks, which is Credit Karma took something that was so taboo. You know, like, you may have a 500 credit score and have such shame around the fact that you don't have a high credit score. But through the platform that they've created, they give you education, they give you tools. They, in one sense, find the tip point in which you are near kind of prime for a business. And they say, hey, you might be qualified for this thing, which they incentivize you becoming a partner and being a better consumer, right? Like, it's kind of brilliant because in the end, they incentivize you to do what you can to get a better credit score. And if you have a better credit score, you have access to more things in our mainstream financial systems. I think for us, that's the way we look at what we're trying to do, which is your criminal history has to come out of the shadow. We've got to remove the shame. We got to remove the stigma, because we cannot even do the deep work that needs to be done if people get to stigmatize you and you get to sit in your shame. And so the truth of the matter is, mass incarceration, and the research shows us, for a lot of people, it was almost inevitable that you would have had a criminal record. And truthfully, in a lot of communities, having a criminal record is like going to college, because there's just so little opportunity where they are. So this idea that you have a criminal record can't be the thing that keeps you stuck. And the very first part of that is you have to take ownership of your criminal justice data, and the government has to be a partner in giving that to you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Laurin. And to our audience, thank you for joining us as well. And we look forward to seeing you next Monday.